All right, guys, I'm going to do a video on if you're having head gasket issues or coolant in the oil issues with your 12 valve. I want to do a video on what to check, how to check it, and then if you're doing a head gasket, how to check the head to see if it's flat. Now, I do recommend to always have your head surfaced. Any of you guys watch any of my videos, you've heard me say that before. I recommend to always have it surfaced. Don't have the machine shop check to see if it's flat, surface it. They're never flat. Or I shouldn't say that. I've surfaced hundreds of them, and I've maybe had 3 that were relatively flat. But you still take 2-3 thou off, 4 thou off, you know, like at least 4 thou off to get them to clean up perfect. So that's telling you right there. And you know, your block is always going to have distortion. So if you can pull distortion from the head and only have distortion in the block, you're way better off. So anyways, so I got a brand new head here. I got it sitting on the bench, so I figured I'd do a video. I was thinking about it. So something that I wanted to show, and I have showed this in another video as well. But something, if you're having coolant in your oil issues, something that I wanted to show was you want to check, pull all your valve covers off and check inside here. Because what'll happen, I think I actually have a picture of one that I sent to a customer. His was cracked like this. I'll see if I can find that picture. If I can't, I'll show you what I'm talking about. But what happens is, and you can see the marker. Actually, maybe let me try this one might. So what happens is the head will crack in here from basically from the bottom of your spring bucket across in here. So you want to check all of the cylinders, in that same spot, because they are bad for doing that. Now somewhere else too to check is, and this one's reinforced because it's a newer style casting, but they did crack in here, but obviously that's not going to put oil, or it's not going to put coolant into your oil. But this one, and we see lots of them when we pressure test them that are cracked like that, so make sure that you check. Now that is something, and you'll be able to see if it's leaking there will be a clear line. You will see the crack for sure. Something, if you don't see anything but it's weird looking, fire it up with the valve covers off, just at an idle, and let it run for a while. And yeah, it makes a little bit of a mess with oil. At an idle, it's not too bad. But you'll definitely thank me if you find that it's got a crack in there, because 1, you don't have to pay anybody to check it. 2, you don't take it off, have it surfaced. And because if you don't have it magnafluxed, there again, I recommend, if you're taking your head in, you're having coolant problems, magnaflux, pressure test, surface. For me on these things, like that's a must. You have to do it. But anyways, do that, check it, and then if that's all good, that part, something else you want to check. This is your oil cooler, and it's underneath your oil filter housing. Now, it's a little bit of a screw around to get this off, and they're not really bad for failing, but if you have a lot of coolant in your oil, like I'm talking 4, 5, 6 liters, maybe even more than that, I honestly would pull, either way you should pull, if you have that much contaminants in it, you should pull your oil cooler out and replace your oil cooler, because you can't get these 100% clean. So you'll still have contamination. You'll have to change your oil a bunch of times, and these aren't that expensive. But I would pull this out, and there again, either you can just replace it or you can pressure test it. I'll show a video on how we pressure test it and then how you guys could do it. It's not really, you know, you can build a little jig for doing it pretty easy, and you can put, you know, your shop air to it, because these things see lots of pressure and don't have issues. But I'll do another video on that. But so you've checked that, you've checked this. Now at this point, if you didn't find anything wrong with your oil cooler, you didn't find any cracks here, it's time, pull cylinder head off. So pull cylinder head off. Obviously this is sitting on the bench, so it can't pull cylinder head off, but per se, let's say we're pulling the cylinder head off. I wouldn't recommend rolling around on a dirty table either, especially if you've had it surfaced, but this one isn't even cleaned yet. So now what you want to check, you can check right off the hop, is make sure there's no cracks. Make sure there's no cracks in here. You can run them with cracked valve seats. These are not these are integral valve seats. They can't fall out. I personally don't recommend it because you can, it basically, when you have a crack there, if the crack starts to open up, basically it will shoot fire through it, and eventually it eats a big hole through it and turns into a bad day. But that's just, I personally recommend not to run it. They do crack in here. Usually that won't put coolant into the oil. Unless it's really bad, but I've never actually seen one of these ones actually leak coolant pressure testing them. I'm sure that they probably have. There again, hit me up in the comments if you've had one leak like that, or if you had any of these problems, or maybe even a problem that I've never seen. Also too, they will crack in between your, in here sometimes. There again, I've never seen that leak coolant, but if they're cracked, a crack is a crack, it's not gonna get better. So you put it back on, the crack is gonna keep going. So I personally recommend, if it's cracked, find a different cylinder head, buy a new one, buy a good used one, whatever it may be. These aren't that expensive. I would recommend, just if you need a new cylinder head, you know, either buy an exchange or just buy a new one. But so if you got the cylinder head off, you want to check the block. Now, if you go back in my videos, I'll see about linking it. I showed how to clean block surface. Please don't use a cookie for cleaning it. That's the worst thing you can do. It screws the surface up. But what you want to do, so you need a straight edge. You need a precision straight edge to do this properly. This one that I have is a snap-on one, which doesn't have to be a snap-on one, but a good precision ground. And the easiest way to see a precision ground is, it's hard to tell here, but there's actually a hardened surface on this edge, and then it's physically actually ground. And that was actually something that I don't know, I might look into doing some of these, because they're actually hard to find good precision grinds for some reason. But anyways, I think I'm gonna have actually a section on the website when I get it going, that I keep saying, but I haven't got it, haven't got that far yet, I'm gonna have a tool section for all the different tools that I use and stuff that I'm gonna bring to market and blah, blah, blah. But anyways, so what you wanna do is you wanna get this thing set in there. And what I'll do, so there's a couple ways of doing this. Now, this head's probably not even flat. I guess we'll find out here in a second, never checked. But if you take a flashlight and you can kind of, oh, let's just get it away from that hole, because there's a hole there, obviously. You can actually see, I don't know if you can still see it in the video, you can actually see the light through it. This is a really bright light. But what you want to do is you put it across like that. Now, just try to get the whole head in the picture here. What you want to do is take a feeler gauge. I always surface these, so I personally don't really check. Like if a customer asks me to check because they don't want to spend the money to do it, I'll check. But I prefer to have a good surface, know that the surface is good and flat, and then just screwing around with it. Now these ones, right from the factory, it's hard to see. Oh, you can see it. It's like 5 miles of bad road. Like it's like, you guys can hear it or not. It's not, I don't like the surface on them personally. Lots of guys run them, never have an issue, but I personally don't like the surface. So we always surface them. But what you do is, and lots of times, you want to go from front to back, straight front to back. You just put a feeler gauge in there. This one is a 2 thou feeler gauge. And if there's resistance on it, you know that it's tight. Usually you can see air through it if it's not, but you can just pull it and you can see, you know, you can see that when I pull on it, well, you see there, it's actually right there. You can get 2 thou under that. So that shows you right there, but that could be, yeah, it could be just because of the, yeah, it must be just because of the surface. It's weird, and the holes aren't just perfect either on it. But something else that you want to do, and I recommend always doing this, because these heads are bad for twisting like this. They don't always, well, they banana too, so they go like this, right? Like, so it'll be low here, or they'll twist from end to end, corner to corner, like diamond. So what I recommend is always go across like that and do the exact same thing, and just make sure that it's good. That's what I recommend doing, and then do the exact same thing the other way. And something to note on your block and your head, these things are really bad for blowing head gaskets right here in this corner. So this is, you know, your thermostat housing is right here. So passenger side front corner. You want to do this same thing with your block, and make sure you don't have a really distorted block, because if you do, you're going to have to address that. But you want to make sure you check this head's good, because it's relatively flat actually, which is actually surprising, because sometimes these things come and they're bad. But you want to make sure that you check really good in this corner, that you don't have a low spot in here. So like what I recommend is like check like in here really well. And even on the block side of things, you want to check really well, just to make sure that you don't have a low spot. And then, like I said, lots of times these things aren't flat. So I always recommend to have it surfaced. Like I honestly tell guys, you know, if you want me to check it, that's fine. I charge $10 to check it. And not very often we're not surfacing them. You know, I recommend to guys to just surface it. But you know, it's not my truck, not my engine. So if you don't want me, you know, when we're doing it, if you don't want it, then I won't do it. I recommend it nonetheless, but what do you do? So anyways, if you go through all that and you've serviced your head, good head gasket, and there's lots of good manufacturers for head gaskets, make sure if you are using your head bolts over again, make sure if you buy an individual head gasket, they don't always come with it. You buy an upper end gasket set, they do come with it. It comes with a little gauge that you can check the head bolts with. But if you don't have that gauge, what you can do is if you take the head bolts, so on a Cummins, on a 12 valve, there's three different length bolts. What you can do is just take the 2 bolts. Now obviously these aren't the right bolts, but this is an easy way to do it. If you take the bolt and you take the other bolt and put it like that, and if it touches in the top corner and it touches in the bottom corner, and they all do that, you always want to use this as your control, and they all touch like that, they're not stretched. So because they're not all going to be stretched, there'll be at least one. So if you get one that's a different length, like let's say you get one that's shorter than the rest, that means the rest are stretched. But very seldom are you going to have all of them stretched of that same length. Better with the gauge, but if you don't have a gauge, you don't have a gauge. Now, as far as head bolts, head studs go, there is a bunch of different options. I know some guys are asking about cap head style ones, the regular head bolts, or doing ARP head studs, or the knockoff head studs. I can't think of the name. There's a bunch of different ones, but personally, I have never used any of the aftermarket, or I should say cheap alternative head studs personally, so I don't have an opinion. I was actually thinking about buying a set and trying them, just to see, you know, and give my opinion on them, look at them, fit, finish, that type of stuff, but I haven't done that yet. Maybe I'll do that in later video. But do fit and finish compared to an ARP stud, and then maybe a cap head video. I personally not a huge fan of the cap head, but there again, if you want to try it, by all means, give her a whirl. If you have done it, you've done cap heads, you've done the cheap head studs, comment down below. Let us know how it went, how long they've been in there. I would actually like the feedback to know how they are, because if it's a good alternative. There again, for me, I think I'll use the ARP stuff, but if it's a good alternative for guys that don't want to spend or don't have as much money to spend, don't get me wrong, I'll offer them as long as it's a good product. I just want to make sure. I hate selling, or no, I shouldn't say that because I don't sell cheap product. I hate when guys buy cheap product and then get burned by it. So that is the reason that for me, I can't justify to use that stuff, because if it blows a head gasket, I have to warranty a head gasket if I build an engine. You guys do it and it blows a head gasket, you got to do a head gasket for yourself. Different story, right? So anyways, if you've got the head studs figured out, perfect. Head studs, head bolts, whatever you're doing. Make sure if you do a torque to yield bolt, you do not retighten. So that bolt, you do it, it's done. Now, if you're doing a cap head, you're doing a stud of any brand, you do need to retorque. Retorque, 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 retorque. Maybe one more time, retorque. I personally, I over torque them by 10 to 15 foot-pounds, sometimes higher on my own stuff, but it's my own stuff. But 10 to 15 foot-pounds higher. I recommend to check them at least 3 times. You want to do it hot, do it hot. I personally, what I'll do is I'll do a drive cycle. We put the engine together, you get it hot, we do a retorque on it. It's not usually hot, but it'll be warm because it's hard to work on an engine that's, screaming hot. So, 180 degrees, it's hard to work on it. So it's not hot, but hot. You can do it while it's cold if you want. Some guys there will argue, say you have to do it while it's hot because everything's expanded. If they're loosened, they're loosened, because when you do it, the torque spec is done at cold, so they've accounted in their torque spec for bolt expansion. So whatever floats your boat. You want to do a hot retorque, screaming hot, do a hot retorque. We do it, we take it for a drive, we usually let it sit for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, then we do a retorque on it. Completely up to you how you want to do that. Now, that being said, I think that I got everything covered that I wanted to cover in this. Yeah, I guess the only thing I didn't talk about was O-rings. So if you want an O-ring, you can fire ring if you want. Myself personally, fire rings, I recommend, and there again, people will argue with me. If you're going to fire ring, I recommend to put a receiver groove on the cylinder head. Actually, maybe I should show. Hold on, be right back. So, O-ring. It's a stainless steel O-ring wire. And the most common is a 41 thou. This is a 41 thou wire. You can do 51. I think there was even 61. I always use 41. And what you do is you cut a receiver groove. You cut a receiver groove in the cylinder head. My awesome art skills. And then you insert this wire into the cylinder head. And for a 12 valve, I leave, depending on the application, depending on the thickness of the head gasket, all changes it. But about 15, between, let's say the range is between 9 and 15 thou protrusion of the O-ring. And you do that across the cylinder head. Now what this does is add seat pressure to the head gasket. Now if you, because there's a fire ring on the head gasket, a width about that wide or so, about that wide. And then this adds seat pressure to that head gasket. And now if you're doing this, you must stud. In my eyes anyway, I guess you don't have to, but I recommend you must stud. Now, fire ring is a 105 thou thick solid steel wire, or ring I guess. This, you must have a head gasket to go with it, because the fire ring I was talking about has been cut out. Now, lots of guys will cut just a receiver groove in the cylinder head, and this just sits there where the 41 thou wire actually you hammer that into the groove. This actually just sits there. So you have the head gasket, you put it on, you set that down in there, and if there's no receiver grooves on the block, it just sits in the head gasket till you have everything in the right spot, and then you're good to go. Now, you can put the receiver groove on the cylinder head, the receiver groove on the block, or you can do both. There on that one, it's a hit or miss on how, it's a personal preference more than anything. Myself personally, if I'm going to fire ring, I recommend receiver groove on the head and the block, fire ring, and you're good to go. Personally, that's what I recommend. If you're going to O-ring, you'll ring the cylinder head and good to go. Now, what some people argue is that if you screw up the cylinder head, cylinder head cracks, warps, if you cut the receiver groove in just the block for this, then you don't have to cut a receiver groove in the cylinder head again. Valid point, but I think that myself, if you're going to the point where you need to have a fire ring, that you should have a receiver groove block and head to add sealing properties. So it's now, depending on where in your area, every area maybe is going to be a little bit different. I charge to O-ring a cylinder head. After it's been pressure test surfaced and washed, you're $390 Canadian to O-ring it. Now, if you're fire ringing it, your brain's not working that good. I charge $350 to cut the fire ring groove. Now, that does not include the fire rings. It does not include the head gasket. Now, if you're doing the block, then you're $350 to do the block as well, if that's the only thing we're doing. But the block has to be pulled out and it has to be stripped for us to do it. I will not do it while the block is in the vehicle. Some guys will, I won't. Completely up to you if that's how you want to do it. I won't do it because of the metal and all that stuff. So, but some guys do and don't have problems. Perfect, awesome for them. I don't do it. So I guess that's that's something just to think about if you are doing it. I would recommend, if you're gonna hot rod the truck at all, O-ring, set of head studs, and you're good to go. Up to a lot, like my truck, my daily drivers, I don't know. I'm gonna dyno in the spring. Right now on the winter tune, it's 622 horsepower, and we're at 3,600 feet elevation. So it works pretty good for what it is. That's on the winter tune. So on the summer tune, it probably is in the 7 to 750 horsepower range ish. There again, we'll find out when I dyno it. But that'll be it for this video. Like, subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, let us know. Comments on what you've done in the past for studs, head bolts, all that type of stuff. I want it. I want the feedback, guys. So let me know what you guys have got done, what you're doing, what you're gonna do, and we can have a conversation from there. Anyways, catch you on the flip side.